Hello, and welcome to the Annie Altman Show, the podcast formerly known as True Shit. My name is Annie Altman, and I really enjoy asking people questions about what this whole being human experience is like for them. And sometimes I enjoy talking my own circles around questions, like in this episode, the second take of Yes and Annie, Black and White versus Gray. This podcast is field research for the Humanity, an interactive stand-up comedy musical philosophy show about how no one ever fully knows how to be a human being. If you're listening to this now, you're fortunate enough to choose your truth. I choose to believe that objectivity is the sum of subjectivities, meaning humans collectively create truth. I'm here with the second solo episode doing a take 2 of the first one, a more, quote, formal, official, in 30 minutes episode with a structure that I have from making, quote, mistakes, quote, wrongs on lots of other podcasts and learning how to put out content that is structured and flowy at the same time. So to start with, to answer my own question to myself of what is truth to you, to me, the word truth is rooted in trust. And I believe everything is feelings. Everyone is making feelings-based decisions and then intellectualizing, logicizing why they're making those feelings-based decisions. And to me, trust and truth are feelings. It's a feeling of safety, which I can describe best as a relaxing of my central nervous system, which can include butterflies, excitement, happiness, joy, all of those sort of spikes. And it's like the people feeling like the cliche of male-female dynamic, of males being offended, of being called safe, or that a female will say they feel safe. Well, and I'm putting that in heteronormative terms, and it is real there, and it is also, to me, an evolutionary thing that we all crave safety. I have found for me that truth is where I feel a lot of safety, because so much of life is so unknown, which is where so much of the fun is. And because unknowns are, to me, synonymous with, I was going to say synonymous with anxiety, and that's not entirely true. That has been true in a lot of my experience, and also anxiety can be synonymous with excitement. Part of what I find gives me more space to explore more unknowns is to have baseline truth, trust, a safety net for that term. And part of the structure of the 10 C's of the Humanity is a safety net. Having a true shit thesis statement for the podcast topic is a safety net. It's a life raft is another metaphor of something to hold on to while I let go of other things and explore, let go of expectations, ideas about things that I'm going into in the unknown. So this first topic that I'm doing a second time, a second practice of, to me, yes and between black and white and gray looks at consciousness, because to me that is consciousness, is looking at the whole spectrum with the awareness that I can never look at the whole spectrum. And black and white and gray to me is one way to visualize that spectrum, where black and white are the two extremes, and then there's infinite shades of gray throughout. And the transition, if you want to look at it in an ombre, in a fade, could be a nice metaphor as well. And just I like to visualize that also on the bell curve, and sort of combining a bell curve graph in my head with a black to white color spectrum. And I really like that both of those are helpful tools and visualizations for me to check in about where my thought process is. And black and white thinking is a seemingly common thought process. It's definitely one I've had a lot of experience with, and having tools to visualize it and bring consciousness to when I'm doing that is really helpful to me to better understand. Zooming out, generally for me, sometimes zooming more in, usually out, and to see how I'm looking at things and what sort of perspective I am having on anything that's happening in my life. So the podcast challenge is going to be to look at something on a spectrum again. So purposely to double look at it. Look at something on a spectrum if you participated in the podcast challenge for the first take of this episode, and then look at that thing again on a spectrum, maybe a different spectrum, maybe a different way of looking at it. To me, this true shit thesis to yes and black and white and gray, to accept it as a whole spectrum rather than to say that life is all black and white or life is all gray, because as I said in the first episode, I believe that when people say no black and white thinking, nothing is black and white, that is more black and white thinking. There are black and white things and there are gray things. And to me, what this true shit thesis really represents is the concept that good and bad are made up, that right and wrong are labels that we give to things, and that can be a helpful tool to navigate our decisions to see, do I feel, quote, better or worse from doing this thing, from thinking this thought, a way to check in with our feelings. And also, in my personal experience, getting overly attached to just black and white, or getting overly attached to gray and everything being gray, ends up rigidly boxing me in to a perspective where I'm missing out on a lot of the spectrum of what is actually happening in life. And black and white thinking can also be called catastrophizing, going to an extreme, and I definitely am an extremist personality who enjoys exploring the extremes and finds comfort in the black and white, perhaps because they are seemingly more clear and straightforward, and also finds that learning about the black and white helps me learn about the gray, and vice versa. It's perhaps the circle is also a spectrum, or maybe it's some sort of circle with a shading. If someone ever wants to design that would be pretty cool. The yin yang, some people like to say, which I tend to laugh at, and also, there is yes and, there's always to say things, symbolizes to me this yes and between black and white and gray, sort of, in that it shows the black in the white and the white in the gray. It represents duality, and it also being a circle so that it is all together. And I am in the camp, the belief group of time being a circle. That is how I visualize it. Sometimes I visualize it more as a spiral, and this sort of journey we're going in circles where we go into ourselves more, or out and expand into the world while we connect with other people more. And like good and bad being made up, duality is made up in a sense that it's a yes and. We are in this physical reality. We are matter, and also we are energy. There's more than just this physical reality. So black and white could potentially represent the physical reality, and gray is representing the things that we can't see, we can't touch, and we all experience. And that place of the gray, to me, is the more feelings-based side, the spiritual side. To me, emotions and spirituality are very connected in being that is unseeable, untouchable, that is not, quote, manifest. And black and white is the binary, 0-1 math science, the structure that supports this manifest world that we are in, and they need each other. Yes, and it's interesting the more I talk about it and the more I'm aware of how much my tendencies are to go towards black and white in terms of what I share with other people, because sharing the gray feels vulnerable because it's feelings, and it feels messy, and it feels, because it's that unknown, I feel less of a known certainty in sharing than the comfort of sharing more black and white things that I feel have more, quote, proof. There's something manifest, there's a tangible something, and that really speaks to the transition I've had these past 2 years from the pre-med route and taking all the classes to be a doctor and working in 2 different UCSF labs, and 180ing towards yoga teacher training and working for a company that distributed CSA boxes, community supported agriculture, and living in Hawaii, living a car by choice, driving for Lyft, moving here, working at a dispensary, these very different, much more gray, unknown, loopy route choices I've made while creating the Humani, and this podcast being part of that creation. And potentially that is another example of my extremism of committing really hard to one path and then committing really hard to another. And so I committed really hard to the black and white science path, and then I committed really hard to this gray artistic path. And what I feel now is I'm figuring out the ways to merge them and give structure to this podcast, to connect the podcast more directly to the show, to put more of the show out there, to talk through the show, to do all of these things that are yes-anding that part of me that has that very analytical and black and white mind, and use that while also using this gray part of me, brain matters, gray matter, for more wordplay of things. And that seems to be my pattern, to sort of touch one wall and then touch the other wall and then work my way past center and then work my way back to center. And kind of like the pendulum swinging that is always swinging. In some ways, so black and white thinking is very much a mental health topic, which is a topic I have lots of experience with experiencing and discussing. And sometimes I wonder how much, when people talk about the emotion wheel and this whole spectrum of emotions, I feel like each emotion exists on a spectrum. And also I feel like if you keep boiling down, zooming in, compiling the data, that eventually there are only, quote, 2 emotions. And then again, I realize I said earlier, duality is made up, and it is. So also this whole thing of 2 emotions is made up, and also is a real feeling thing to me of electrical charges. There being 2. There's positive and there's negative. And then, yes, okay, so science also has extended metaphors about how the yes and of it being black and white and it being gray. For example, another one that I like a lot is that chromosomally, sex and gender is more complicated than we believe it is, that you can be XO or XXY, that there is a black and white of sex, and there's not. There's more nuance even there, and the gray exists. And I get really excited seeing the places where science and spirituality, where black and white and gray thinking can overlap and come together, because to go back to this bigger spectrum, having more perspectives helps everyone see more of the spectrum. And there's so much more that we can learn when we bring the parts together rather than just committing, I say to myself on the podcast, rather than just committing to one part or the other. And at the same time, bringing all the parts along is kind of a total clusterfuck. And in terms of how this topic is personally relevant to me, with all of these different Annie Altman Show projects that I'm doing towards the Humani, it is a lot of different parts that I'm bringing with me and figuring out how to hold the space, as they say, and as I say in slight sarcasm, as I learned to say for real, all of these different parts. And the parts of me that like yoga and dancing and singing, and the parts that want to write, and the parts that want to talk to people, and the parts that want to make food, and all of these different aspects, like the learning comedy, learning improv, that I can bring all of these parts into the Humani. And in fact, that is a big piece of what I view as its uniqueness, is that I'm bringing all of the parts rather than leaving a part out. And it like very much feels like that, like leaving the house with a bunch of little kids, and I'm collecting all of them and getting them all ready to go. And this seems to be a really common trend in people I talk to of all sorts of ages, where just the general collective consciousness, as I like to call it, is shifting from this idea that you pick one career, you pick one thing that you like to do, and then you go to school for it, and then you go to some sort of training for it, and then you do that for a bunch of decades and you don't do anything else. And more people are shifting their perspective to say, wait, I like doing a lot of different things. These other things are my hobbies. Sometimes I want to do that more, or sometimes it's important to me to have them remain as hobbies and also to have space for them. So while I'm saying all of this, I will also share that there are people who want to do one thing and just do that for a bunch of decades, and that's great. Do that too. The yes and is that that's not going to work for everyone. I feel the same way about the 9-to-5 work schedule, and there being people that really benefit from that, and there being people who really don't. And so the more space we can give to people through covering their basic needs to be a human, the more that we can let people figure out their own answer, their own truth for how they can look at the spectrum of their own thought process and feelings and humaning, and make decisions in their human doing that align with their human being, that put that out into the world for everybody. Because it really is, in my mind, that walking as slow as the slowest member. And so it is in everyone's best interest for anyone to be helped, because we're all walking each other home, as the quote goes. The black and white thinking with mental health has been a really big inspiration for all of these projects and for the Humani, and talking about mental health openly for my own practice of doing that, and for the encouragement of other people to do that, and for the encouragement of people supporting loved ones with their mental health, and what I can share from my experience of all of those things, and how that can lead someone to help their experience to maybe open up. In my mind and my heart, the goal of any is to open up, to put a light, to give some space to something that someone otherwise wouldn't. Because all of these things, philosophizing, giving space to feelings, checking with your emotions, these are all privileges, and to me they are actually basic rights, because hurt people are going to hurt people. And so the more everyone is taken care of, meaning the more they have time and space to take care of themselves, the more they have resources to take care of themselves, that is the most effective route, I believe, to minimize human suffering. And there's going to be suffering, because there is no good and bad, and there is good and bad, and suffering is part of life. There's going to be happy and sad for those labels. There's going to be ups and downs. And there are things we have control over, and there are things we do not have control over. And distribution of basic resources is something I feel very passionately that humans do have control over. And it's depressing to me that we have yet to use that control to distribute basic resources to everyone. We've distributed so much stuff, and yet to have those things be food, water, and shelter. And that's sad. And I don't know what to do about it. I know a lot of people don't know what to do about it. And I know a lot of people are doing things about it. And what feels most effective for me to do is to talk about it, and to talk about mental health, because mental health and houselessness and addiction are all intricately tied and are all things that, well, are being talked about more, are still in really dark corners because they exist in dark corners of us. And people, they're hard to talk about. They're challenging to talk about because they're challenges. And also it's a lot more challenging not to talk about them. And so that is a big part of why I'm here, putting myself in positions that feel vulnerable, of sharing too much about myself or sounding preachy or sounding like I know everything or have everything figured out, or whatever negative voice wants to come up that says why I shouldn't be doing what feels good to me to be doing. And to say that all anyone can do is what they believe is, quote, right at the time, what they believe is most aligned with them at the time, with the truth that they're aware of, with, for me, the trust I'm feeling with myself of how I can contribute to a more, quote, positive world, which, again, if there's no positive and negative, what does that even mean, Annie? And I'm not totally sure. The parts that I trust and am sure about are that things like death and breakups, there's loss that is going to happen. And also there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of domestic abuse, there's a lot of stealing that could really easily be prevented by people having basic resources covered. And so being able to make decisions in alignment with the truth that we as humans have collectively put forth, that as humans in humanity, that humanity collectively believes that food, water, and shelter, that these are basic human rights, and follows through with that in action. And my dream is the world with that being the case, and people with that perspective, and imagining how much more space people would have to both do things they want to do and to relax when they can trust that basic coverage. And change has to come from people who have the privilege to talk about these things, because the people who don't have the privilege to talk about these things don't have the privilege of time and space, money to do things about this. And because of all sorts of power imbalances and dynamics that I know very little about. And so my best bet is to ask a lot of questions and to talk about it and put things out there, and have that lead me to more questions. I feel like for me, my black and white thinking is my best and worst quality, is a best and worst quality of mine, or a I guess there's only one best and one worst in that sort of black and white thinking of phrasing that. And I find more and more that for all of us, that thing, that quality that we can contribute is a yes and of something that is helpful and harmful in our lives. It's like the person who is so good at talking about feelings and talking to friends about their feelings and listening to friends talk about their feelings, and that being such an amazing way to contribute and to help people, and that being an emotional burden or potential emotional labor, or a lesson in setting emotional boundaries, in the same way that my black and white thinking is a lesson in setting a boundary from black and white thinking, maybe in using that for that in consciousness, in zooming out, in being aware of what is happening, which a lot of black and white thinking as well can come to control, and how little control that anyone has in the world. And I've had a lot of experience with hyper-controlling food has been a big outlet of mental health and black and white thinking for me, of literally every type of disordered eating and every type of rule of what kind of food I can eat and how much and when, and all of the things from this black and white belief that came from a desire for rules and this wish that life was black and white, cause and effect all the time, which it sometimes is, and to say, oh, if I do this in this way, then this thing will happen, and I have control over what is going on, which all comes from the root of not having control over when I die and not having control over when life is done, and among many other things of not having control, that one being that that was a real cough. That one being the root of that fear of unknown that we all have, because we were all born. We don't know how we got here. We don't know when we're leaving here, unless people choose it, which is a reference to suicide, and that might be an override of every evolutionary impulse. So are they choosing that? That's a separate podcast. All of these things are really important for me. I'm going back into mental health generally and away from food. And to touch on suicide, I believe that people commit suicide, yes, because they feel suicidal and because they're feeling that in addition to feeling unable to share with someone about those feelings, and that black and white boxed in or overly swimming in the gray without something to hold. And the only real action I have of what I can do towards that, to help that, is for me to talk about my life, my mental health, my views on humanity, because that's all I have control over, is what I put out there. And so that is how I hope that this is useful to someone listening, is that it inspires them to put their truth out there, however that feels best to them, to look at their black and white, their gray, their tendencies, to that part of the checking in, the reflecting, the taking the time to be with yourself is the part that I care about encouraging. Because the expression of that truth, it's like the expression of the yoga poses, is the secondary part. And there's so many different ways to do that. And putting a podcast out is not what everyone is going to want to do to share their perspective. And I really do believe that everyone's perspective is valuable. And so everyone sharing it in some way that feels good to them is valuable for everyone. And because all I can speak from is my own experience and the value that I've received from putting the things out there in this way that feels good to me. And with black and white thinking, again, being a strength and a weakness, the inner mean voices of mine that are rooted in really intense black and white thinking will respond pretty reasonably to black and white thinking back to them, to me saying, hey, no, black and white thinking is still black and white thinking, to me presenting cause and effect data, quote unquote, of just putting out a podcast even consistently, and that being a data point and a way that I can almost give that quality of mind reflection on the other side of the graph. And perhaps that's really what the use for someone listening that I care, that I wish someone walks away with this from, is that whatever that thing is that you're the most insecure of, because in my experience, this black and white thinking that I have so much insecurity of because of feeling this vulnerability that it shines a spotlight on my mental health, and me being a messy human, an emotionally messy human, at times physically messy, emotionally messy is what I care about being seen as. And what I'm doing with the Humanity and the Annie Altman Show projects is leaning into that and letting that thing that well, to bring this back full circle to trust, that this thing that my impulse says to trust and my fear is scared to. And so I encourage you listening to first really give yourself the time and space to figure out what that thing is. What is that thing that feels, I like to ask the question of relief versus regret, that feels like it would be a relief to share, to put out in some way into what you are giving back in your exchange of consciousness for the charge C. This feels really rambly at the moment. And to lean into that and to explore how you can use that thing, because it seems really likely in my experience that that thing is exactly the thing for you to lean into to contribute to consciousness collectively. Because that is the thing that your consciousness is exploring the edges of. Whoa. That for me, my OCD part, which is especially the one with black and white thinking that I'll get insecure about, that is also the part of me that is pioneering these explorations in different ways. In the same way, for someone else, some part of theirs that is some insecurity, some sort of brings up some fear of being seen because it wants to be seen, part in them is what is exploring some other part of the consciousness for all of us. And the more that we can all encourage people to do that, the more that we can all learn from everyone exploring. I care a lot about everyone exploring consciousness because for my mental health experience, that has been incredibly useful and valuable, and feels to me like what I can at this moment contribute to other people. So maybe like 15 seconds of that last bit in there made sense somehow. Virtual audio journaling and videoing for the first time, and the camera is tilted, which my black and white thinking perfectionist mind is like, oh my God. And also it's like, what a beautiful metaphor for me to be aware again of my tendencies and what's going on, and remember that I am the expert of my own humaning, my own spectrum. Everyone is the expert of their humaning, their own spectrum. And the more I can learn about my spectrum is the only route I can contribute to other people learning about theirs. Thank you so much for tuning in for the second one. I would love to hear your feedback on the structure and time frame. And thank you so much, Sunny, for your encouragement and for listening and for honest feedback and for helping each other explore our spectrums. Thank you so much for people listening, people who've given me feedback about this podcast. To them, and spectrums are circles, and weird voices are part of normal voices. Okay, I'm gonna cut myself off there. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Thanks for being you. Hey, thanks for sticking around till the end. Please check out theanniealtmanshow.com and also patreon.com/The Annie Altman Show if you're able and interested in donating $1 or more per month to these projects. Non-dollar ways to share value includes and is not limited to sharing anything, the podcast, any YouTube video, any blog post, any social media account, subscribing, following anywhere, rating or reviewing anything, sending any feedback or ideas, and or connecting me with people for the podcast or other projects you feel would enjoy this work. In my opinion, word of mouth is the only quote real advertising, so here I am using words from my mouth.